The lake cabin had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the noise and demands of city life. Tucked away in the forest, the cabin was quiet, surrounded by the sound of rustling trees and the gentle lap of water against the dock. It was a place I went to clear my mind, to find peace. This time, though, things were different. My neighbor, Mrs. Olson, had insisted I come out to the cabin while she visited her longtime friend, Mr. Everett. I'd heard about Mr. Everett before, a retired professor, an old friend who'd lived across the country for most of his life. He was in town for a few weeks, and she thought it would be nice if he joined me at the cabin. I hadn't expected to see anyone, but something about her excitement convinced me to agree. After all, maybe some company would be a good thing. When I arrived at the cabin that morning, Mr. Everett was already there, standing on the dock with his hands tucked into the pockets of a well-worn jacket, gazing out over the lake. He looked different than I'd imagined, a tall, lean figure with a calm yet intense presence that made me pause for a moment before stepping out of the car. His hair was a soft silver, swept back, and his expression held a depth that intrigued me. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice warm but reserved. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled, and I felt the faintest hint of a blush creep up my cheeks. "Good morning, Mr. Everett," I replied, stepping forward and extending my hand. His handshake was firm, his skin warm and calloused, and I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on mine, just a moment longer than expected. "Call me Thomas," he said, his gaze unwavering. "No need for formalities here." I nodded, feeling oddly flustered. "All right, Thomas. It's nice to finally meet you." The day passed in easy conversation, filled with stories of his travels, his years teaching literature, and his love of the outdoors. We spent hours on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the light shift over the lake as the sun climbed higher into the sky. I found myself laughing more than I had in months, drawn in by his humor and insight, by the way he seemed to understand the world with a quiet wisdom that I found both comforting and mysterious. As the afternoon turned to evening, the air grew cooler, and Thomas suggested we build a fire by the shore. I helped him gather firewood, brushing shoulders and exchanging quiet smiles as we worked. By the time the fire crackled to life, casting a warm, golden glow over us, I felt a strange sense of closeness to him, a feeling I hadn't anticipated. We sat side by side on the old wooden bench, the firelight dancing over his face, highlighting the lines and creases that told stories of a life well lived. He looked at me then, his gaze intense yet gentle, and I felt my pulse quicken. "This place," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels timeless, doesn't it?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at me, that made my heart beat faster. It was as if he could see right through me, as though he understood every unspoken thought, every hidden longing. "Thank you for inviting me," he added, his hand resting on the bench just inches from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a steady, grounding presence that drew me in, even as a part of me knew I should pull back. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice barely audible. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire and the distant call of a loon. Our hands were so close now that I could feel the warmth of his skin, the roughness of his fingers against mine. I hesitated, my heart pounding, caught between the urge to close the gap and the knowledge that this was uncharted territory, a place we might not be able to return from if we crossed that line. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers brushed mine, a feather-light touch that sent a thrill racing up my spine. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and saw the same unspoken question in his eyes, the same hesitation, the same quiet yearning. "I didn't expect this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. His fingers lingered on mine, warm and solid, grounding me in the moment, holding me there in that fragile space between anticipation and reality. "Neither did I replied, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I knew this was forbidden, that we were treading dangerous ground, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. There was something in his gaze, something deep and real, that held me captive. We stayed like that for a long moment, our hands barely touching, the weight of the unspoken hanging between us. I could feel the warmth of his body, the subtle rise and fall of his breath, and I knew that this was a moment I would never forget. And then, in a single, decisive movement, he closed the distance between us, his hand covering mine, his thumb tracing slow, gentle circles over my skin. His touch was both reassuring and electric, a quiet promise that held a depth of emotion I hadn't anticipated. He looked down at our hands, his expression contemplative, as though he were struggling to put into words the feelings that simmered just below the surface. "I'm not sure this is appropriate," he said, his voice soft but filled with an unmistakable tension. "I know," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But sometimes things just happen." He met my gaze, and for a moment, we were suspended in that unspoken understanding, each of us holding on to the fragile connection we'd found in this quiet, unexpected moment. The fire crackled softly, the flames casting shifting shadows over us, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of comfort and belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. His hand remained on mine, his touch steady, grounding me even as my thoughts spun with the weight of what was happening. "Tell me something about yourself," he said softly, breaking the silence, his gaze gentle yet intense, as though he were seeing me for the first time. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. There was so much I wanted to share, so much I'd kept hidden, but under his steady gaze, the words seemed to come easily. I've been searching for something," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't even know what it is, really. Just a feeling, a sense of connection. Something real." He nodded, his expression softening as he listened, his hand tightening around mine in silent understanding. "I think we're all searching for something," he replied, his voice low and contemplative. "But sometimes we find it in the most unexpected places." His words hung in the air, a quiet truth that resonated deep within me. I looked up at him, my heart racing, and for a moment, I saw something vulnerable, something unguarded in his gaze, a glimpse of a man who, like me, had been searching, longing for something beyond words. The silence stretched between us, filled with the quiet understanding that had grown in the spaces between our words. And in that moment, I felt a shift, a softening of the barriers we'd both held up, a willingness to step into the unknown, to explore the connection that had drawn us together. He lifted his hand, his fingers tracing the curve of my cheek, his touch light and reverent, as though he were afraid to break the spell we'd woven around ourselves. His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching, and I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is this all right?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible, his fingers lingering on my cheek, tracing slow, gentle circles that sent a thrill through me. I nodded, unable to speak, my gaze locked on his, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet joy that filled the empty spaces within me. His hand moved down, resting on my shoulder, his touch a steady, grounding presence that held me in the moment, anchoring me to him. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us moving, each breath a quiet confession, each touch a silent promise. And as the night deepened around us, I knew that this was a moment I would carry with me, a memory that would linger, etched into my heart. The fire crackled softly as we sat in the quiet embrace of the night, and I felt the world slip away, leaving only the warmth of his hand and the steady rise and fall of his breath beside me. Time seemed to melt, stretching and folding in on itself, leaving just the two of us in this fragile, stolen moment. After a long pause, Thomas leaned in closer, his gaze searching mine, as though he were looking for something unspoken, something I wasn't sure I even knew how to give. His hand brushed my shoulder, and I felt the weight of his touch settle over me, grounding me even as my pulse raced. "This," he murmured, his voice low and rough around the edges, "this feels complicated, doesn't it?" I swallowed hard, a faint smile playing at the corners of my lips. "Complicated," I echoed, the word carrying a truth that felt far too simple for everything stirring inside me. He shifted, and I could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes, a silent struggle playing out in the lines of his face, in the way he held himself just a little too still, as if afraid that any movement might shatter the delicate balance between us. "Maybe," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Complicated is exactly what we need." The words hung between us, and I felt the air shift, the unspoken weight of my confession settling over us. His hand lingered on my shoulder, warm and steady, his thumb tracing gentle circles that sent shivers down my spine. He looked at me then, his gaze softening, a quiet warmth replacing the tension in his eyes. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, this connection we'd found was real, undeniable. He leaned in, his face just inches from mine, and I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin, the quiet intensity of his gaze pulling me in, filling every empty space within me. His fingers moved, tracing a path down my arm, lingering just long enough to leave a trail of warmth, and I felt my breath hitch, caught between anticipation and hesitation. "Thomas," I began, my voice trembling with everything I wanted to say, but couldn't find the words for. He reached up, his hand cupping my cheek, his thumb brushing softly over my skin, and I leaned into his touch, feeling the weight of his presence settle around me, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. His gaze met mine, a question lingering in his eyes, a silent invitation that left me breathless. Without thinking, I leaned forward, closing the distance between us, my lips brushing his in a kiss that was soft, tentative, a hesitant exploration of the connection that had grown between us. For a moment, he stilled, as if surprised, but then his hand slipped to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as he deepened the kiss. It was gentle at first, slow and unhurried, as though we had all the time in the world. But as the moments passed, the restraint began to melt away, replaced by a deeper, more insistent longing. His hand moved to my back, pulling me closer, and I felt the warmth of his body pressed against mine, grounding me even as my heart raced. The world seemed to fade around us, leaving only the quiet intimacy of the moment, the soft brush of his lips against mine, the warmth of his hands steadying me, anchoring me to him. Each touch, each kiss felt like a revelation, a promise whispered in the silence. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest, and I looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of regret. But his gaze held only warmth, a quiet tenderness that made my heart ache. "This feels," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "so much more than I expected." I nodded, words escaping me, my gaze fixed on his, my thoughts a jumble of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. There was a vulnerability in his expression, a raw openness that left me feeling both exhilarated and exposed, as though we had peeled back the layers that kept us apart, baring our souls to each other in a way that went beyond words. He reached for my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine, and we sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet bound together by the connection that had woven itself between us. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows over us, and I felt a quiet contentment settle over me, a warmth that filled every corner of my heart. "I don't know what this means," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper, "but I know I don't want it to end." I tightened my grip on his hand, feeling the same longing mirrored in my own heart, and I nodded, unable to put into words the depth of my feelings. Whatever this was, it felt right, as though we had stumbled upon something rare and precious, something worth holding on to. For the rest of the evening, we sat together in comfortable silence, our hands entwined, sharing quiet glances and gentle touches. The night stretched on, and as the fire died down, casting the shore in a soft, dim glow, I felt the weight of exhaustion settling over me, a quiet peace filling the spaces where anxiety and hesitation had once lingered. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break over the lake, casting a soft, golden glow over the water, Thomas leaned over, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. "Let's get some rest," he murmured, his voice warm and soothing, and I nodded, feeling the pull of sleep heavy on my eyelids. Together, We walked back to the cabin, his hand steadying me as I climbed the steps, and when we reached the door, he hesitated, his gaze lingering on mine, a question hanging unspoken between us. You can stay, I offered, my voice soft, the invitation wrapped in layers of meaning I knew he would understand. He nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his lips, and he followed me inside, his presence filling the small space with a warmth that settled over me like a comforting blanket. We made our way to the small couch by the window, curling up together beneath a soft throw, his arms wrapped around me, holding me close. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt the steady rise and fall of his breath against my back, the warmth of his body anchoring me, and I knew that whatever happened next, we had found something worth holding on to. The morning light filtered through the window, casting soft shadows over us, and I felt a quiet contentment settle over me, a peace that I hadn't known in a long time. Thomas's arm tightened around me as he stirred, his gaze warm and sleepy as he looked down at me, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice a gentle rumble that sent a thrill through me. "Good morning," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me at the sight of him, at the quiet intimacy of the moment. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the quiet comfort of the morning, the warmth of his presence filling the space around us. And as the morning unfolded, I knew that this was a beginning, a fragile, beautiful beginning that neither of us could fully understand, but that we were both willing to explore, one step at a time. As the sun continued to rise, casting soft, golden hues across the room, I felt Thomas's hand gently tracing the curve of my shoulder, his fingers leaving a trail of warmth in their wake. The cabin was bathed in morning light, and with it came a sense of clarity, a quiet realization that this connection, however unexpected, was as real as anything I'd ever known. We stayed wrapped in each other's arms for a while longer, the silence between us filled with a comfortable intimacy, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we'd formed. His hand lingered on my arm, his touch feather-light yet grounding, and I found myself leaning into him, savoring the warmth and strength of his presence. Eventually, Thomas shifted, propping himself up on one elbow as he looked down at me, a softness in his gaze that sent a thrill through me. There was something about the way he looked at me, a mixture of tenderness and understanding, that made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't before. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice a gentle murmur, as if he were afraid of breaking the delicate spell between us. I hesitated, searching for the right words to convey the swirl of emotions within me. I didn't expect this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But now that we're here, it feels like maybe this was meant to happen." He nodded, his thumb brushing gently over my shoulder in a small, soothing gesture. "I know what you mean," he replied softly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Sometimes life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" A faint smile tugged at my lips, and I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle over me. The connection we'd found, the quiet understanding that had grown between us, felt both unexpected and inevitable, as if we'd each been searching for something, without realizing it until we found it in each other. We spent the morning like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, sharing stories and laughter, the hours slipping by unnoticed. I told him about my life, about the things I'd kept hidden, the dreams and fears I'd never voiced aloud. And he listened, his gaze intent and focused, as though each word mattered, as though every detail of my life was something precious. In turn, he shared pieces of himself, stories of his past, memories he hadn't revisited in years. There was a vulnerability in his voice, a quiet honesty that made my heart ache. I felt the weight of each story, each confession, as if he were peeling back the layers of his guarded exterior, revealing the man beneath, the man I was beginning to know and care for in a way that went beyond words. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the warmth of the morning giving way to the gentle breeze drifting in from the lake, we found ourselves drawn outside, to the shore where the world felt open and vast. The lake was calm, the surface mirroring the sky above, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me as we stood side by side, our fingers brushing, a silent promise woven between us. Thomas reached for my hand, his grip firm and steady, and we walked along the shoreline, the water lapping gently at our feet. The quiet companionship, the shared glances and soft smiles, felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite define, yet knew I wanted to hold on to. At one point, he stopped, turning to face me, his expression thoughtful, a question lingering in his eyes. "Do you ever wonder if we meet people for a reason?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. I looked at him, feeling the weight of his words resonate within me. "Yes," I replied, my voice soft. "I think sometimes people come into our lives to teach us something. Or maybe to remind us of what we've forgotten." He nodded, his gaze holding mine, and in that moment, I felt as though we were sharing something far deeper than words, a connection that went beyond the surface, touching something raw and real within us both. As the day unfolded, we returned to the cabin, the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows over us. We settled on the porch, each of us lost in our own thoughts, yet bound together by the quiet intimacy that had grown between us. It was during one of those peaceful silences that he reached out, his hand finding mine, fingers intertwining in a gentle, grounding gesture. His thumb brushed over the back of my hand, a small, reassuring touch that sent a thrill through me, reminding me of the depth of the connection we'd found. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet sincerity, "for sharing this with me, for letting me in." I looked up at him, feeling a warmth spread through me, and I smiled, my heart swelling with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "Thank you, too," I replied, my voice soft, "for being here, for understanding." His gaze held mine, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. And as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a gentle, lingering kiss, I felt a quiet joy fill every corner of my heart, a sense of belonging I hadn't known I'd been missing. The kiss deepened, slow and unhurried, each touch, each caress a silent declaration, a promise whispered in the quiet of the cabin. His hands found their way to my shoulders, steadying me, grounding me in the moment, and I felt myself surrendering to the warmth of his embrace, the steady strength of his presence. As the day turned to evening, the light outside shifting to a warm, golden hue, we sat together, wrapped in each other's arms, the quiet of the cabin settling over us like a comforting blanket. The world outside seemed distant, unimportant, and all that mattered was the warmth of his hand in mine, the gentle rise and fall of his breath against my shoulder. We didn't speak much, letting the silence carry our thoughts, each touch, each glance filling the spaces where words weren't needed. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, casting a soft, silvery glow over the lake, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet contentment that filled every corner of my heart. There was a timelessness to the night, a sense that this moment, this connection, would linger in my memory, etched into the fabric of who I was. And as Thomas held me close, his fingers tracing gentle patterns along my arm, I knew that this was a night I would never forget, a night that had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. As the stars cast their silvery glow over the lake, the air around us grew still, a quiet serenity settling over the cabin as Thomas and I sat wrapped in each other's embrace. Every breath felt significant, every heartbeat a steady reminder of the rare connection we'd found. There was a profound stillness between us, a shared understanding that this night would leave an indelible mark on both our lives. Thomas's fingers continued their gentle patterns along my arm, his touch a quiet reassurance, grounding me in the present, in the here and now. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence seep into me, filling spaces I hadn't even known were empty. The cabin seemed to breathe with us, a silent witness to the moments we shared, to the unspoken promises that lingered in each glance, each touch. After a long silence, Thomas shifted, his gaze soft and contemplative as he looked down at me. "There are some things you don't expect to find later in life," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes, those are the things that matter most." His words hung in the air, weighty and bittersweet, and I felt a lump form in my throat, my heart tightening with the weight of all we'd shared. There was a part of me that wished this moment could stretch on forever, that the dawn would never come, and that we could remain in this cocoon of warmth and connection. "I know what you mean," I replied softly, my voice trembling with the emotion I felt welling up within me. "Meeting you, being here, it's made me see things differently. It's like a part of me woke up that I didn't know was asleep." He smiled then, a quiet, almost wistful smile, and I saw the reflection of my own emotions in his eyes: gratitude, wonder, and the faintest hint of sadness. Because we both knew, deep down, that the world outside would look different in the light of day, that the quiet magic of this night would fade against the reality waiting for us beyond the walls of this cabin. Slowly, he lifted my hand, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles, a gesture that felt both intimate and reverent. "Whatever happens next," he said, his voice a soft murmur, "I want you to know that this meant everything to me." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt my eyes grow misty as I looked at him, taking in the quiet intensity of his gaze, the warmth and sincerity that radiated from him. There was a finality in his tone, a quiet acceptance of the transience of this moment, and I realized that, no matter what lay ahead, we would carry this night with us, a cherished memory that would remain etched into our hearts. The weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand in mine, filled me with a bittersweet joy, and I felt myself leaning into him, savoring the closeness, the quiet intimacy that had grown between us. We sat together in silence as the night deepened, the stars above us glimmering like distant promises, and I felt a quiet contentment settle over me, a peace that went beyond words. When the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting soft pink and golden hues over the lake, I felt a pang of sadness, a reluctant acceptance that this night was coming to an end. Thomas looked out over the lake, his gaze soft, reflective, as if he, too, was holding on to every last moment, every last detail. Finally, he turned to me, his expression gentle, a quiet warmth in his eyes that filled me with both comfort and longing. "We'll always have this," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, a bittersweet acceptance filling the spaces where hesitation and fear had once lingered. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We'll always have this." As the morning light crept into the cabin, illuminating the room with a soft glow, we slowly disentangled ourselves, the warmth of his touch lingering on my skin, a silent reminder of the connection we'd found. The quiet intimacy that had bound us throughout the night remained, a subtle but undeniable presence, as we shared a final, lingering embrace, each of us holding on just a moment longer. With a soft, parting smile, he brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering for a brief, stolen second before he pulled back, the space between us filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. As we made our way outside, stepping into the morning light, I felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, a deep, abiding appreciation for everything we'd shared. The lake was calm, its surface a mirror reflecting the early morning sky, and I found myself lost in its quiet beauty, the memories of the night woven into the soft hues of dawn. Thomas stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the horizon, and I knew that, for both of us, this moment would remain a cherished memory, a reminder of a connection that had transcended the ordinary. After a final, lingering glance, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze, a silent farewell, and we parted ways, each of us carrying the memory of the night with us, etched into the depths of our hearts. As I watched him walk away, a sense of peace settled over me, mingling with a quiet ache of loss, and I knew that, whatever happened next, the memory of this night, of this connection, would remain a part of me, a beautiful, bittersweet reminder of a love that had blossomed in the quiet spaces between dusk and dawn.